The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and whiskey through the swinging doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon, as 12-year-old Tommy Fletcher pushed his way through the crowd of miners and cattlemen, his small frame nearly invisible among the rough men who had come to drink away the hardships of another brutal day on the frontier. The boy's clothes were patched and threadbare, his face gaunt from too many missed meals, but his green eyes burned with the kind of determination that poverty and loss couldn't extinguish. Tommy clutched a crumpled piece of paper in his trembling hand, the final notice that would determine whether he lost the only home he'd ever known. His parents had died in the cholera outbreak that swept through Silver Creek 6 months earlier, leaving him with nothing but a small cabin and 40 acres of land that barely produced enough to keep him alive through the harsh Montana winters. The boy made his way toward the corner table where Harrison Blackwood sat, counting money and reviewing loan documents, his expensive suit and gold watch marking him as the most prosperous man in 3 counties. Blackwood owned the First Bank of Silver Creek and held mortgages on half the property in the territory, his wealth built on the desperation of farmers and ranchers who had nowhere else to turn when times got hard. "Mr. Blackwood, sir," Tommy said quietly, his voice barely audible above the noise of drinking and gambling that filled the saloon. "I need to talk to you about my family's debt." Blackwood looked up from his paperwork with the kind of cold irritation that wealthy men reserved for interruptions from those they considered beneath their notice. His pale eyes took in Tommy's obvious poverty and youth with obvious disgust, as if the boy's presence somehow contaminated the atmosphere of profitable business dealings. "What are you doing in here, boy?" Blackwood snapped, his voice carrying across the nearby tables and drawing attention from men who were already 3 drinks into forgetting their own troubles. "This is a place for men conducting serious business, not for orphan brats begging for handouts." "I'm not begging, sir," Tommy replied with dignity that was remarkable given his desperate circumstances. "I came to ask for more time to pay what my parents owed. I've got a job working for Mrs. Henderson, and I can make payments every month if you'll just give me a chance." The simple request for fairness and opportunity should have been easy enough to grant, especially to a child who was clearly trying to honor his family's debts through honest work. But Blackwood's response revealed the cruelty that lay beneath his veneer of respectable business practices. "More time?" Blackwood laughed harshly, his voice loud enough to ensure that everyone in the saloon could hear his response. "Boy, your parents owed me $200 when they died, and that debt doesn't disappear just because you're too young and stupid to understand how the world works." The casual dismissal of Tommy's desperate plea sent murmurs through the crowd, some showing sympathy for the orphaned child, while others watched with the morbid fascination that drew people to witness suffering they were powerless to prevent. "Please, Mr. Blackwood," Tommy persisted, his voice growing stronger despite the hostile reception he was receiving. "I know the land isn't worth much, but it's all I got left of my family. If you could just let me keep making payments, I promise I'll work harder than anyone to pay what's owed." The continued pleading from a child who refused to accept rejection seemed to enrage Blackwood beyond all proportion to the situation, and his face flushed red with the kind of anger that came from having his authority questioned by someone he viewed as completely powerless. "You promise?" Blackwood snarled, rising from his chair with violent intent written across his features. "You think your promises mean anything to me, you worthless little beggar?" What happened next shocked even the hardened men who frequented the Silver Dollar Saloon, accustomed as they were to witnessing the casual cruelty that frontier life often bred in those who lacked moral restraint. Blackwood's hand flashed out in a vicious backhand slap that caught Tommy across the face with enough force to send the boy sprawling across the floor, his small body hitting the rough planks with a sickening thud. The sound of the blow echoed through the suddenly silent saloon like a gunshot, and for a moment every conversation stopped as men processed what they had just witnessed. The sight of a wealthy, powerful adult striking a defenseless orphan child was shocking even by the standards of a frontier community where violence was often accepted as a necessary part of life. Tommy lay on the floor for a moment, blood trickling from his split lip, and his eyes showing the kind of stunned disbelief that came from experiencing adult cruelty that exceeded anything he had imagined possible. But even as he struggled to regain his footing, his first instinct was to protect the crumpled paper that represented his only hope of keeping his family's land. "Let that be a lesson to you about bothering your betters," Blackwood said, with obvious satisfaction, his voice carrying clearly in the shocked silence that had fallen over the saloon. "Your parents' debt comes due in 3 days. And if you can't pay every penny, I'll take that worthless patch of dirt and sell it to someone who can actually make it productive." The threat to steal a dead family's property from their orphaned child was delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that revealed Blackwood's true character beneath his facade of respectable business practice. Several men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, their consciences pricked by the obvious injustice they were witnessing. But it was a voice from the back of the saloon that cut through the tension like a blade through silk, calm and controlled, but carrying an undertone of authority that made even the drunk miners pay attention. "Seems to me," said the voice with quiet menace, "that hitting children is the kind of behavior that separates civilized men from animals." Every head in the saloon turned toward the source of the comment, and what they saw was a man who commanded respect through presence rather than wealth or position. Jake Morrison stood near the bar, his weathered hands resting casually near his guns, and his steel-grey eyes fixed on Blackwood with the kind of focused intensity that experienced gunfighters recognized as extremely dangerous. Jake Morrison was 63 years old and had spent 40 of those years building the most successful ranch in 3 territories. But more importantly, he had built a reputation for fairness and integrity that made him respected by every honest man who knew him. His word was considered as good as any legal contract, and his judgment in matters of right and wrong was trusted by people who had learned that wealth and power didn't automatically confer wisdom or moral authority. "This is none of your concern, Morrison," Blackwood said, though his voice lacked the confident authority he had shown when dealing with a helpless child. "The boy owes money he can't pay, and I'm within my legal rights to collect what's owed." "Legal rights," Jake repeated thoughtfully, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous calm that made smart men reconsider their course of action. "That's an interesting concept, Blackwood. Tell me, what gives you the legal right to strike a child?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire, and Blackwood's face showed the flush of embarrassment that came from having his actions challenged by someone whose moral authority exceeded his own financial power. "The boy was being disrespectful," Blackwood said defensively, his voice showing the first signs of uncertainty as he realized that his comfortable position of unchallenged authority was being questioned by someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. Jake walked slowly across the saloon floor, his boots making no sound on the rough planks, but his presence seeming to fill the entire room as men stepped aside to give him a clear path to where Tommy still knelt beside Blackwood's table. "Son," Jake said gently, kneeling down to Tommy's level and examining the boy's injured face with the kind of careful attention that suggested genuine concern rather than mere curiosity. "Are you hurt badly?" "No, sir," Tommy replied quietly, though his voice shook with the aftermath of shock and pain. "I'll be all right. I just wanted to ask about making payments on my family's debt." Jake's expression darkened as he heard the simple honesty in the boy's voice and understood that Tommy had been struck for nothing more than trying to honor his parents' obligations through honest work and respectful negotiation. "How much does the boy owe?" Jake asked, rising to his full height and turning to face Blackwood with eyes that held the kind of cold fury that had made him legendary during his younger days as a lawman. $200, Blackwood replied quickly, sensing an opportunity. To profit from the situation, plus interest and penalties for late payment, call it $250 total. The casual addition of $50 in fictional penalties revealed Blackwood's intention to exploit the situation for maximum profit, and several men in the crowd began to mutter among themselves as they recognized the banker's dishonest tactics. Jake reached into his coat and produced a leather wallet, his movements deliberate and controlled as he counted out bills in denominations that represented more money than most of the men in the saloon saw in months of hard labor. "Here's your $200, Blackwood," Jake said quietly, placing the money on the table with the kind of finality that suggested the transaction was not open to negotiation. "The boy's debt is paid in full, and you'll provide him with a receipt showing the account is settled." The unexpected payment of Tommy's debt sent a shock through the crowd, as people realized they were witnessing an act of generosity that went far beyond normal business dealings. But Blackwood's response revealed that his greed exceeded even his surprise at this turn of events. "I said $250. Blackwood insisted, his voice showing the kind of desperate avarice that characterized men who viewed every human interaction as an opportunity for profit. "The penalties and interest bring the total to $250. Jake's smile was cold as winter wind, and his hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his gun as he processed Blackwood's attempt to extort additional money through fabricated charges. "Blackwood," Jake said with deadly quiet, "I'm going to give you one chance to reconsider that statement. The boy's parents borrowed $200, and $200 is what gets paid. Any attempt to collect fictional penalties will be treated as theft and dealt with accordingly." The threat was delivered in conversational tones, but every man in the saloon understood that they were witnessing a moment that could determine whether justice or greed would prevail in their community. The tension in the Silver Dollar Saloon stretched taut as a bowstring as Harrison Blackwood found himself facing a choice between accepting Jake Morrison's payment or pushing his luck against a man whose reputation for settling disputes permanently was legendary throughout the territory. The banker's pale eyes darted around the room, seeking support from other men of influence, but found only faces that showed either sympathy for the orphan boy or anticipation of seeing Blackwood's greed finally meet its match. "Morrison," Blackwood said with false bravado, his voice carrying the wheedling tone of a man who suddenly realized he might have overplayed his hand. "Surely you understand that business transactions involve more than just the principal amount. There are legitimate costs associated with carrying delinquent accounts." Jake's response was to place his hand on the butt of his Colt, a gesture so casual that it might have seemed accidental to someone who didn't understand the language of frontier justice. But every man in the saloon recognized the motion for what it was. A promise that further attempts at extortion would be met with the kind of permanent solution that had made Jake Morrison's ranch the most peaceful place in 3 counties. "Blackwood," Jake said with the patience of a schoolteacher explaining simple arithmetic to a slow student, "the way I see it, you've got 2 choices. You can take this money, give the boy a receipt, and walk away from this situation with your dignity intact. Or you can keep pushing for money that isn't owed and discover what happens when honest men get tired of dealing with thieves who hide behind bank charters." The barely veiled threat sent visible tremors through Blackwood's carefully constructed facade of civilized respectability, and he began to understand that his comfortable position of unchallenged authority was being directly challenged by someone who possessed both the means and the will to enforce a different kind of justice. Tommy watched the confrontation with wide eyes, hardly daring to believe that someone was finally standing up to the banker who had terrorized his family for months. with threats of foreclosure and financial ruin. The boy's injured face served as a constant reminder of Blackwood's cruelty, and the sight of his split lip and developing bruise was making several men in the crowd increasingly sympathetic to Jake's position. "Mr. Morrison," Tommy said quietly, his voice showing the kind of mature concern that poverty and loss had forced upon him far too early. "You don't have to do this for me. I don't want you getting in trouble on my account." Jake looked down at the boy with an expression that mixed admiration for Tommy's courage with anger at the circumstances that had forced such wisdom on someone so young. "Son," Jake said gently, "sometimes trouble finds you whether you're looking for it or not. When that happens, a man has to decide whether he's going to stand up for what's right or let bullies have their way with folks who can't protect themselves." The simple explanation of moral principle seemed to resonate with many of the men in the saloon, several of whom had their own experiences with Blackwood's predatory lending practices and his willingness to use legal technicalities to steal property from families who had fallen behind on their payments. "Besides," Jake continued, his voice taking on the kind of steel that had made him one of the most respected men in the territory, "I've got a particular dislike for men who hit children. In my experience, that kind of behavior tends to escalate if it's not addressed immediately and decisively." Blackwood's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger as he realized that his assault on Tommy was being used to justify Jake's intervention in what he considered a private business matter. The boy was being disrespectful and disruptive, Blackwood protested, his voice showing the strain of someone who was used to having his actions go unchallenged by the community that depended on his financial services. "I was merely maintaining order and teaching him proper behavior toward his betters." The explanation for his violence revealed more about Blackwood's character than he probably intended, showing a man who viewed children as property to be disciplined rather than human beings deserving of protection and respect. "His betters," Jake repeated, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous amusement that preceded sudden violence in men who had learned to settle disputes with guns rather than lawyers. "Blackwood, that boy has shown more courage and honor in the past 10 minutes than you've displayed in your entire miserable life." The insult was delivered with such casual authority that it struck Blackwood like a physical blow, and his hand moved instinctively toward the small pistol he carried for protection during his business travels. But the motion was noticed immediately by Jake, whose own draw was so fast that his Colt was cocked and aimed before Blackwood's weapon had cleared its holster. "I wouldn't," Jake said conversationally, his voice showing no more emotion than if he were commenting on the weather. "You're already in enough trouble for hitting a child. Adding attempted murder to your list of crimes would just make the consequences that much more permanent." The sight of Jake's gun pointed directly at his chest froze Blackwood in place, his face going pale as he realized that his comfortable life of financial manipulation and legal intimidation had suddenly become a matter of life and death. "Now then," Jake continued, his voice remaining calm despite the deadly weapon in his hand, "let's settle this business properly. You're going to take the $200 I offered, write out a receipt showing that Tommy's family debt is he paid in full, and then you're going to apologize to the boy for striking him." The demand for an apology from a man of Blackwood's social standing to an orphaned child was almost as shocking to the watching crowd as the original slap had been, representing a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had governed their community for years. "Apologize?" Blackwood sputtered, his voice showing outrage at the suggestion that he should lower himself to acknowledge wrongdoing toward someone he considered beneath his notice. "I'll do no such thing. That boy needed to learn respect, and I taught him a valuable lesson about his place in the world." Jake's expression hardened at Blackwood's refusal to show remorse for his cruelty, and his finger tightened almost imperceptibly on the trigger of his Colt. "Blackwood," Jake said with deadly quiet, "you've got exactly 10 seconds to start writing that receipt and composing your apology. After that, we're going to discuss this matter in a way that you probably won't survive. The countdown that Jake began was marked by a silence so complete that every man in the saloon could hear their own heartbeat, and the tension in the air became so thick it was almost difficult to breathe. 10, 9, 8. Jake's voice carried easily through the silent room, each number falling like a hammer blow on Blackwood's crumbling composure. "All right," Blackwood shouted desperately, his voice cracking with fear as he realized that Jake Morrison was not bluffing about the consequences of continued defiance. "I'll write the receipt. Just put that gun away." Jake kept his weapon trained on Blackwood while the banker's trembling hands fumbled with pen and paper, struggling to write legibly despite the terror that was making his whole body shake with adrenaline and fear. "And the apology," Jake reminded him quietly, his voice showing no mercy for a man who had shown none to a defenseless child. Blackwood looked at Tommy with obvious reluctance, his pride warring with his survival instinct as he struggled to force words of remorse past his lips. I apologize for striking you, boy," Blackwood said grudgingly, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the silent saloon. "It was inappropriate behavior." Tommy looked up at the man who had terrorized him and his family, and his response showed the kind of grace that impressed every adult who witnessed it. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," Tommy said simply, his voice showing no trace of triumph or vindictiveness, despite everything he had suffered. "I forgive you." The boy's immediate and genuine forgiveness seemed to affect several men in the crowd more powerfully than Jake's threats of violence had, and even some of Blackwood's former supporters began to understand that they had been backing the wrong side in this confrontation. Jake holstered his gun and picked up the receipt that Blackwood had written, examining it carefully to ensure that all the proper legal language was included to protect Tommy's ownership of his family's land. "There," Jake said with satisfaction, handing the document to Tommy with the kind of ceremony that acknowledged its importance in securing the boy's future. "Your family's debt is paid in full, and you own that land free and clear." Tommy stared at the paper with tears in his eyes, hardly able to believe that his nightmare of potential homelessness was finally over, and that he would be able to keep the only connection he had left to his parents' memory. "Mr. Morrison," Tommy said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how I can ever repay you for what you've done." Jake smiled at the boy with genuine warmth, his weathered face showing the kind of satisfaction that came from using power and wealth for purposes that actually mattered. "Son," Jake said gently, "the best way you can repay me is by growing up to be the kind of man who stands up for folks who need help, just like your parents would have wanted." As the crowd in the saloon began to disperse and normal conversation resumed, most people were discussing the dramatic confrontation they had just witnessed and its implications for the balance of power in their community. But Tommy remained beside Jake, still processing the magnitude of what had happened and trying to understand what his future might hold now that his immediate crisis had been resolved. 2 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the Silver Dollar Saloon, and the repercussions of that dramatic evening were still rippling through Silver Creek like stones thrown into a still pond. Harrison Blackwood had made himself scarce, conducting his banking business with a newfound humility that surprised everyone who had known him during his years of unchallenged authority. But more importantly, Tommy Fletcher had begun to understand that Jake Morrison's intervention had given him more than just financial security. It had provided him with something he had never dared to hope for since his parents' death. Tommy had moved into the guest quarters at Jake's ranch, not as a charity case or hired hand, but as something approaching family. The arrangement had developed naturally over the days following the saloon incident, as Jake recognized that the boy needed more than just a paid-off debt to truly thrive, and Tommy discovered that his benefactor was genuinely interested in his welfare rather than just making a dramatic gesture. "Tommy," Jake said one morning as they worked together repairing fence posts on the northern boundary of the ranch, "I've been thinking about your education. You're a bright boy, but you'll need more schooling if you want to make something significant of yourself." The boy looked up from the post he was steadying, his face showing the kind of serious consideration that had become characteristic of his approach to any discussion about his future. "I can read and write pretty well," Tommy said thoughtfully. "And my ma taught me arithmetic before she got sick, but I know there's a lot more I need to learn if I want to be successful." Jake nodded approvingly at Tommy's mature understanding of the importance of education, recognizing in the boy the same hunger for knowledge that had driven Jake's own rise from poverty to prosperity. "There's a good school in Denver," Jake continued, "and I know the headmaster personally. He's agreed to take you on as a student with all expenses paid, if you're interested in pursuing that opportunity." The offer of a real education at a prestigious school was more than Tommy had ever imagined possible, but his response revealed the depth of character that had impressed Jake from their first meeting. "Mr. Morrison," Tommy said carefully, "that's incredibly generous, but I need to understand what you expect from me in return. You've already done more for me than I could repay in a lifetime." Jake smiled at the boy's insistence on understanding the terms of any arrangement, recognizing the practical wisdom that poverty had taught Tommy about the importance of clear agreements between people of unequal power. "Son," Jake said gently, "I don't expect anything from you except that you work hard, learn everything you can, and grow up to be a man who uses his advantages to help others who need it. Beyond that, your life is your own, to make whatever you choose." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders coming toward the ranch at high speed in a way that suggested either urgent news or serious trouble. Through the dust clouds kicked up by their mounts, Jake could make out the uniforms of territorial marshals, their presence indicating official business that required immediate attention. "Jake Morrison," called out the lead rider as the group approached, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "I'm Marshal Thomas Bradley, and I need to speak with you about a complaint that's been filed against you." Jake set down his tools and walked toward the marshals with the calm confidence of a man whose conscience was clear and whose actions could withstand any official scrutiny. "Marshal Bradley," Jake replied respectfully, "I'm always happy to cooperate with federal authorities. What kind of complaint are we talking about?" "Harrison Blackwood has filed charges alleging that you threatened him with deadly force during a business dispute," Marshal Bradley explained, his tone suggesting that he was performing a duty rather than pursuing a personal agenda. "He claims you drew a gun on him without justification and forced him to conduct business under duress. The accusation was serious enough to result in federal prosecution if proven, but Jake's expression showed no concern as he processed the legal implications of Blackwood's attempt to use the law for revenge. "Marshal," Jake said calmly, "I'm sure Mr. Blackwood has his version of events, but there were about 30 witnesses to what actually happened that night. Would you like to hear their account of the situation?" Marshal Bradley nodded, his professional experience having taught him that complex situations usually involved multiple perspectives that needed to be considered before reaching any conclusions about guilt or innocence. Over the next hour, Jake provided a detailed account of the events in the saloon, from Blackwood's assault on Tommy through the resolution of the boy's debt and the banker's forced apology. The marshal took careful notes, his expression growing grimmer as he understood the full context of the confrontation that Blackwood had characterized as unprovoked aggression. "Mr. Morrison," Marshal Bradley said when Jake had finished his account, According to your statement, you drew your weapon only after Blackwood reached for his gun first. Is that correct? That's correct, Marshal, Jake replied firmly. I was defending myself and the boy from a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to use violence against defenseless people. Tommy stepped forward with the kind of courage that had characterized his behavior throughout the crisis, his young voice carrying clearly as he addressed the federal marshal. Sir, Tommy said respectfully, I was there when everything happened, and Mr. Morrison is telling the truth. Mr. Blackwood hit me for asking about my family's debt, and he reached for his gun when Mr. Morrison called him on it. The boy's testimony, delivered with obvious sincerity and supported by the visible evidence of his still healing injuries, provided crucial corroboration for Jake's version of events. Marshal Bradley studied Tommy's face, noting the fading bruises that supported his account of being struck by a grown man, and his expression showed the kind of disgust that decent men felt when confronted with evidence of adult cruelty toward children. Son, Marshal Bradley said gently, are you saying that Mr. Blackwood struck you before Mr. Morrison drew his weapon? Yes, sir, Tommy replied without hesitation. He slapped me hard enough to knock me down, and then he threatened to take my family's land, even though I was trying to make payment arrangements. The marshal's questioning continued for another 30 minutes, with Tommy providing details that painted a clear picture of Blackwood's misconduct and Jake's reasonable response to a dangerous situation involving the protection of a defenseless child. Mr. Morrison, Marshal Bradley said finally, based on the testimony I've heard and the evidence I've observed, it appears that your actions were justified under territorial law regarding the protection of minors and self-defense. However, I will need to interview other witnesses before making any final determination. Of course, Marshal, Jake replied. I'll provide you with a list of everyone who was present that evening, and I'm confident that their accounts will support what Tommy and I have told you. The investigation that followed took 3 days, during which Marshal Bradley interviewed dozens of witnesses and gathered testimony that painted a consistent picture of Blackwood's aggression and Jake's restrained response to a volatile situation. Dr. Sarah Patterson, who had treated Tommy's injuries, provided medical evidence of the force used in Blackwood's assault on the boy. Pastor Williams testified about Jake's reputation for fairness and his well-known advocacy for children's welfare. Even some of Blackwood's former supporters admitted under oath that the banker's behavior had been inappropriate and that Jake's intervention had probably prevented worse violence. When Marshal Bradley returned to the ranch with his findings, his expression showed the satisfaction of a law officer who had uncovered the truth despite attempts to obscure it with false accusations. Mr. Morrison, Marshal Bradley announced formally, after completing a thorough investigation, I'm dismissing all charges against you. The evidence clearly shows that you acted in lawful defense of yourself and young Tommy, and that Mr. Blackwood's complaint was filed in bad faith as an attempt to avoid consequences for his own misconduct. The official vindication was gratifying, but Jake was more interested in the broader implications of the investigation for his community's understanding of justice and accountability. Marshal, Jake asked, will there be any consequences for Mr. Blackwood's false accusations and his assault on Tommy? Actually, yes, Marshal Bradley replied with obvious satisfaction. Based on the testimony I've gathered, I'm filing federal charges against Mr. Blackwood for filing a false report and for assault on a minor. He'll be facing trial in federal court, where his political connections won't be able to protect him. The news that Blackwood would finally face real consequences for his actions sent a wave of satisfaction through both Jake and Tommy, confirming that justice could prevail when good people were willing to stand up for what was right. 6 months later, as Tommy prepared to leave for his first year at the Denver Academy, Harrison Blackwood was beginning a 2-year sentence in federal prison for his crimes. The first bank of Silver Creek had been sold to new owners who conducted business according to legal and ethical standards, and the community had learned valuable lessons about the importance of holding powerful people accountable for their actions. "Mr. Morrison," Tommy said on the morning of his departure for school, his voice showing the maturity that months of security and encouragement had fostered in him, "I want you to know that everything good that happens in my life from now on will be because you taught me that there are still people in the world who will fight for what's right." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion as he looked at the confident young man that Tommy had become under his care and guidance. "Tommy," Jake replied gently, "you taught me something just as valuable. You showed me that courage isn't about size or strength. It's about standing up for your principles even when you're outnumbered and outgunned." As Tommy's stagecoach disappeared over the horizon, carrying him toward an education that would prepare him for whatever future he chose to build, Jake reflected on how a moment of violence in a frontier saloon had revealed fundamental truths about justice, courage, and the responsibility that came with power. The banker had slapped an orphan boy at the saloon, but the old rancher had indeed paid that debt with lead, and in doing so had demonstrated that some debts could only be settled through the kind of courage that refused to let cruelty go unpunished. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more incredible stories of frontier justice, moral courage, and the power of good people to stand up against injustice. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of believers in doing what's right.